Then Atwater sent Dole a 10-page letter enumerating the many times the Kansas senator had gone negative in the campaign. And this letter, too, made its way into the media. Dole was furious. Despite his victory in Iowa, he could not get over seeing his wife dragged into the dirt. He would get back at the Bush folk and Atwater. Next up was the New Hampshire primary. Victory here would put Dole well on his way, and he was ahead in the polls. But this time, Bush came out fighting, and the race tightened up. The weekend before the vote, the Bush people ran an ad portraying Dole as a straddler, a man with two faces whose Senate votes depended on expediency, not sincere belief. Humorous, deceptive, bitingly negative, the ad had Atwater's fingerprints all over it. And the timing was perfect. Too late for Dole to respond with an ad of his own. The ad helped propel Bush into the lead, and a few days later, to victory. Shortly after the results of the New Hampshire primary were in, NBC newsman Tom Brokaw caught up with Bush and asked if he had any message for his rival. "Nah," he replied with a smile, "just wish him well." Then Brokaw found Dole and asked the same question. "Yeah," said Dole with a bitter scowl, "stop lying about my record." In the days to come, Dole's answer was rerun again and again on television and discussed in the papers. It made him look like a sore loser. The press began to pile on, and Dole was ungracious. He seemed whiny. A few weeks later, he went down to a crushing defeat in South Carolina, and shortly thereafter an even worse string of losses in the Super Tuesday primaries throughout the South. Somewhere along the line, Dole's campaign had crashed and burned. Little did he suspect that it had all begun in Iowa. Interpretation. Lee Atwater believed that adults could be divided into two groups, the overly mature and the childlike. The overly mature are inflexible and overserious, making them highly vulnerable in politics, particularly in the age of television. Dole was clearly the mature type, Atwater the child. It didn't take Atwater much research to see that Dole was hypersensitive about attacks on his wife. Replaying old charges against her in Iowa, Atwater was able to get under the senator's skin. He kept Dole's blood boiling with the letter that accused him of starting the dirty campaigning, and he upped the pressure with the perfectly timed ad that mocked Dole's record for New Hampshire voters. Although Atwater was the one pushing buttons, Dole's outburst to Brokaw focused all attention on him and his unsportsmanlike behavior. Atwater, a genius at one-upmanship, now stood back. Dole could only respond with more sourness, compounding the problem and leading to electoral suicide. The easiest types to one-up are those who are rigid. Being rigid does not necessarily mean being humorless or charmless, but it does mean being intolerant of anything that breaks their code of acceptable behavior. Being the target of some anarchic or unconventional antic will trigger an overreaction that makes them look sour, vindictive, unleaderlike. The calm exterior of the mature adult is momentarily blown away, revealing something rather peevish and puerile. Do not discourage such targets from getting personal. The more bitterly they protest and criticize you, the worse they look. They forget that the real issue is how they are perceived by the people around them, or in an electoral race by the public. Inflexible to the core, they can be induced to make mistake after mistake with the slightest push. 5. In 1939, Joan Crawford, 1904 to 1977, talked her way into a relatively minor role in the film The Women, the lower-class perfume salesgirl who steals the husband of an elegant woman played by Norma Shearer. Crawford and Shearer were also bitter rivals in real life. Shearer was the wife of the movie producer Irving Thalberg, who always managed to get her the best parts. Crawford hated her for that, and for her haughty manner. Thalberg had died in 1936, but to Crawford's disgust, the studio was still pampering Shearer. Everyone in Hollywood knew of their mutual dislike and was waiting for the showdown. But Crawford was the consummate professional on the set, and she kept matters civil. The Crawford and Shearer characters in The Women share only one scene, the climax of the movie when Shearer finally confronts Crawford about the affair with her husband. The rehearsal went well, as did the master shot showing the two actresses performing together. Then it came time for close-ups. Of course, Norma Shearer went first. Crawford sat in a chair off camera, delivering her lines to Shearer. Many actors would have an assistant or the director feed the lines while they retired to their dressing rooms, but Crawford always insisted on reading them herself. Crawford was knitting an afghan at the time, and as she said her lines, she knitted furiously, then stopped when it was time for Shearer to respond. She never looked Shearer in the eye. The needles made a loud clicking sound that began to drive Shearer crazy. Straining to stay polite, Shearer said, "Joan, darling, I find your knitting distracting." Pretending not to hear, Crawford kept knitting. Finally, Shearer, a woman famous for her elegance, lost control. She screamed at Crawford, ordering her off the set and back to her dressing room. As Crawford walked away, still not looking at Shearer, the film's director, George Cukor, ran to her side, but Shearer commanded him to come back. Her voice had a bitter tone that no one there had heard before, and few would forget. It was so unlike her. Or was it? In 1962, Crawford and Bette Davis, longtime stars who had never appeared in the same movie, were finally to co-star in Robert Aldrich's film Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Crawford and Davis had never been thought to like each other too much, but Crawford had encouraged the pairing. As good publicity, it would help to extend their careers. Once again, their behavior was civil on set, but after the film came out, it was Davis, not Crawford, who was nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. Worse, she immediately started crowing about it, proudly announcing that she would be the first actress to win 3 Oscars. Crawford had only 1. Davis was the center of attention at the Oscars. Backstage, before the event, she was unusually gracious to Crawford. After all, she could afford to be. This was her night. Only 3 other actresses were nominated, and everyone expected Davis to get it. Crawford was equally polite. During the ceremony, however, as Davis stood in the wings, waiting, she hoped, to accept the award, she got a shock. She lost. Anne Bancroft won for her role in The Miracle Worker. And there was more. As Davis stood taking it in, she felt a hand on her arm. "Excuse me," said Crawford, as she strode past the stunned Davis to accept the award on Bancroft's behalf. The Oscar winner could not be there that night. On what was supposed to be Davis's night of glory, Crawford had somehow stolen the limelight, an unbearable affront. Interpretation. A Hollywood actress has to be thick-skinned, and Joan Crawford was the quintessence of the Hollywood actress. She had a huge capacity to absorb and deal with insults and disrespect. Whenever she could, though, she plotted to get the last laugh on her various nemeses, leaving them humiliated.